At 0430 on October 13th, 1942, Hospitalman Second Class Robert J. Morrison crouched in the cramped aid station 800 meters south of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Rain hammered the canvas roof in waves. The temperature held at 95 degrees despite the downpour. Humidity sat at 90%. Morrison could barely breathe. 17 wounded Marines lay on improvised cots fashioned from ammunition boxes and salvaged parachute silk. Most had been hit during the Japanese naval bombardment that began at 0100 hours. Battleship shells had torn through defensive positions along the Lunga perimeter. The wounded had been arriving in waves for 3 hours. 7 needed immediate transfusions. 3 more would need blood within 6 hours or they would die. Morrison was 24 years old. He had graduated from the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy in June 1941. 6 months later, Pearl Harbor happened. He enlisted in the Navy on December 9th. By March 1942, he was assigned to the 1st Marine Division as a field corpsman. He landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th with the first assault wave. It was now October. He had been treating wounded Marines for 67 consecutive days. The aid station smelled like copper and gangrene. Flies swarmed despite the rain. Morrison moved from cot to cot checking vital signs. Private First Class William Hendricks had taken shrapnel to the left leg. The femoral artery was damaged. He had lost approximately 2 pints of blood. His pulse was weak. Respiration shallow. Without a transfusion, Hendricks would be dead by 0800 hours. "How we doing, Doc?" Hendricks whispered. His lips were grey. "You're going to be fine," Morrison said. "Just need to get some blood in you." That was the problem. Getting blood. Morrison walked to the corner of the tent, where they kept medical supplies in wooden crates marked with red crosses. He opened the crate containing plasma. 6 bottles remained. He lifted one to the light. The liquid inside was cloudy, contaminated. He checked the date stamped on the glass. September 27th, 16 days old. In this heat, plasma lasted maybe 10 days before bacterial growth made it lethal. He opened the 2nd bottle. Same problem. 3rd bottle, 4th bottle, 5th bottle. All contaminated. The 6th bottle looked clear, but Morrison knew better than to trust it. Using spoiled plasma killed faster than blood loss. The last supply ship had arrived on October 7th, 6 days ago. It brought 30 bottles of plasma. 15 were already ruined when they arrived. The heat during the 3-week voyage from San Diego had cooked them. The other 15 lasted less than a week in Guadalcanal's climate. Now all 30 were useless. The next supply convoy was scheduled for October 25th, 12 days away. Assuming the Japanese Navy did not sink it like they sank the last 2 convoys, assuming it arrived on schedule, assuming the plasma survived the voyage, 12 days was eternity for the 17 wounded Marines in this tent. Morrison had one alternative: fresh whole blood from living donors. The 1st Marine Division had established a donor program in August. Any Marine with typo blood could volunteer. Typo was universal. It could be given to anyone regardless of their blood type. The battalion had 47 typo donors on the roster. The problem was preservation. Fresh blood drawn from a donor lasted 4 to 6 hours at room temperature before the red cells began to break down. In 95-degree heat, that window shrank to 3 hours. Maybe 4 if you were lucky. Morrison could call for donors right now, get 7 Marines down here. Draw blood, transfuse immediately. But battles did not happen on convenient schedules. What if they needed blood at 0300 hours? What if they needed 20 units instead of 7? What if the donors were in the middle of combat when the call came? The current system was failing. 68% of Marines who needed transfusions died anyway. Not from enemy fire, from lack of available blood. Morrison had lost 3 patients in the past week. All 3 bled out while waiting for donors to arrive. Lance Corporal Thomas Riker died on October 6th, while 2 typo Marines were pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire half a mile away. By the time they reached the aid station, Riker had been dead for 20 minutes. Corporal James Holland died on October 8th. His donor arrived in time, but the man had contracted malaria 2 days earlier. His blood was unusable. Morrison watched Holland fade while he frantically tried to find another donor. There was not enough time. Private Second Class Anthony Delgado died on October 10th. His donor arrived. Blood was drawn. Transfusion began. Halfway through, Morrison noticed the blood had already started to separate. The red cells were clumping. The plasma was turning yellow. The donor had been waiting in the heat for 90 minutes before Morrison could start the procedure. That 90-minute delay killed Delgado. 3 men. 3 preventable deaths. Morrison remembered every detail. He also remembered that his younger brother was somewhere on this island. Private First Class. Daniel Morrison was assigned to 2nd Battalion 1st Marines. Robert had not seen him in 3 weeks. Communications between battalions were sporadic. Robert did not know if Daniel was alive or dead. But he knew that if Daniel got wounded and needed blood, the same broken system would determine whether he lived or died. Standing in that sweltering tent surrounded by dying Marines, Morrison made a decision. The system was not working. Doctrine was not working. He needed to find another way. The rain intensified outside. Water poured through gaps in the canvas. Morrison watched it pool on the ground. The water was cold, not freezing, but cold. Mountain runoff from the interior highlands. He had noticed it before. During the monsoon season, rainwater collected in streams and pools at temperatures far below ambient air temperature, sometimes as low as 40 degrees. An idea formed. Morrison had read about blood preservation in medical school. The research was limited, most of it theoretical. The conventional wisdom was clear. Do not freeze blood. Freezing destroys red blood cells. Ice crystals rupture cell membranes. Frozen blood is dead blood. But what if you did not freeze it completely? What if you just kept it cold, not frozen solid but chilled, cold enough to slow bacterial growth and cellular breakdown, warm enough to avoid ice crystal formation? It was a theory, an untested theory. Every Navy medical manual said it would not work. Every instructor Morrison studied under said freezing or near-freezing blood was pseudoscience, medical quackery. But the alternative was watching more Marines die. Morrison walked outside into the rain. Water soaked through his uniform in seconds. He knelt and put his hand in a puddle. The water was cold. He estimated 42 degrees, maybe 40. Cold enough. He looked back at the tent, at the 17 wounded Marines inside, at Private First Class Hendricks, who had maybe 4 hours to live. Standard protocol said to wait for donors. Standard protocol said fresh blood only. Standard protocol had a 68% fatality rate. Morrison stood in the rain and thought about Thomas Riker, James Holland, and Anthony Delgado, 3 men who followed protocol right into their graves. He thought about his brother Daniel somewhere on this island. He walked back into the tent, grabbed a notebook, started sketching diagrams, calculating temperatures, planning a system that every medical authority said was impossible. If he was wrong, Marines would die. If he did nothing, Marines would die anyway. The rain kept falling. Morrison kept planning. At 0547, Sergeant Michael Hayes entered the aid station. He was Morrison's closest friend in the battalion. They had gone through corpsman training together at Portsmouth Naval Hospital. "Heard you needed blood," Hayes said. Morrison looked up from his notebook. "Not yet, but I need to talk to you about something." "What?" "Something crazy." Hayes sat down on an empty ammunition crate. "Crazy is all we got left on this island." Morrison explained his idea. Use rainwater to create a cooling system. Collect fresh blood from donors. Store it in metal containers surrounded by cold water and ice. Keep the temperature between 35 and 40 degrees. Not frozen, just cold. Cold enough to preserve it for 24, maybe 48 hours. Hayes listened without interrupting. When Morrison finished, Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "That goes against every regulation," Hayes finally said. "I know. The chief medical officer will never approve it. I know. You could face court-martial for experimenting with unauthorized procedures." "I know." Hayes looked at the rows of wounded Marines, at Hendricks, whose breathing was getting shallower. "When do we start?" Hayes asked. At 0602, Morrison returned to the drenched aid station carrying a battered canteen cup filled with rainwater, his hands shaking in the damp pre-dawn. Hayes was there, rolling gauze with muddy fingers. The air still seethed with humidity, punctuated only by the whir of insects and distant shell fire near the Matanikau River. Rain beat down like fists on the canvas above them, louder than rifle fire. "The cold lasts just a couple hours if we use the helmet water as it falls," Morrison said, looking past Hayes to the steel bowls and empty canteens lined along a wooden crate. "That rain could buy us priceless time." Hayes nodded, not saying a word, eyes darting to the wounded Marines whose lives now rested in the balance between desperation and innovation. Morrison moved quickly, pulling the smallest medical instruments from a canvas satchel. Using a rusty thermometer, he measured the rainwater in a battered mess tin, 38 degrees, colder than any refrigerator available on Guadalcanal. With every trembling movement, he reviewed his memory of lectures at Philadelphia. A professor coolly explaining that red cells rupture if frozen, that storage under 42 degrees was unthinkable back in school. Yet, as the droplets ran down his arm, Morrison realized this was as much technique as act of faith. "At 0617, we need to test if blood cells survive this temperature," he murmured. Rainwater trickled down his sleeve while he prepared an empty blood bottle scavenged from a ruined crate. He looked at Hayes. "Draw 2 samples. I'll be the subject." Hayes nodded. "This is insane, Bob. You could die if this does something wrong." Morrison just shrugged, turning away. "If we don't, those men out there will die for sure." Hayes drew 400 milliliters of Morrison's blood, then watched as Morrison plunged the bottle into the icy rainwater, mixed with chips of rough ice from a mess hall stockpile. While the bottle rested in the jury-rigged cool bath, Morrison used a basic field microscope to examine a single drop on a glass slide. "I'll check it every hour until 09. Both men sat in silence, listening to mortar rounds strike the jungle beyond Henderson. Around 0730, the first light crept through mud-streaked canvas. Morrison checked again. Cell structure was preserved, unexpected but real. By 0815, Morrison cross-referenced the blood with a field manual chart, hand-scrawled from Philadelphia. 83% red cell integrity. At room temperature, after 90 minutes, the average was under 50. At that rate, Morrison figured he could save nearly twice as many Marines. If the system was extended, if he dared scaling the test up beyond himself. He worked out the steps over black coffee and field biscuits, fill every helmet, canteen, bowl, and available basin with rainwater at the moment of rainfall. Position the blood bottles in direct contact with the cold metal, submerging up to the neck. Check every 30 minutes with the field thermometer for deviations above 41 degrees. Add more rainwater or ice if available, and always handle bottles with field-clean gauze. At 0946, Sergeant Hayes insisted, "Your turn is up. Can't experiment on yourself more than once." Morrison smiled. "I'd rather it be my blood than theirs." He logged every finding in a rain-smeared notebook. Temp steady, blood not hemolyzed, no visible clotting. At 01013, they retrieved Morrison's sample. Hayes used a field med kit to start a slow reinfusion, Morrison watching for fever or chills, signs of catastrophic reaction. 30 minutes passed. "No reaction. I feel fine," Morrison said, exhaling the anxiety of a condemned man reprieved. By noon, Morrison rushed through the aid station, collecting empty bottles, cleaning them with carbolic acid. He enlisted Private Atwell, a former lab tech, to help organize the makeshift blood preservation pit. In under 3 hours, they prepared a system of buried mess tins, surrounded by river stones for insulation, lined with waterproof sheeting scavenged from cargo parachutes. Sun finally burst out for a moment, steaming rain off the mud as the temperature climbed. The conditions seemed impossible, yet Morrison pressed forward. At 13:15, a heated argument erupted. Commander Dr. Harold Patterson, Chief Medical Officer, strode into the tent, boots caked in red Guadalcanal clay, face twisted with fatigue and incredulity. "What is this blood bottle in a pit? Who authorized unauthorized storage outside regulation?" Morrison stood at attention, spine rigid. "Sir, we are preserving viability beyond current limits. The test worked on myself. It could work for all." Patterson grabbed the notebook, flipping pages. "Have you lost your mind? We don't freeze blood. We don't refrigerate blood in this climate. You're risking lives. This isn't medicine, it's guesswork. Morrison refused to yield. Permission to continue, sir. I believe this can save men who will otherwise die. Patterson's jaw tightened. One more experiment, then I report this up the chain, and you answer for the results directly to the division chief. Morrison nodded. Understood. Patterson stormed out, tension flaring through the tent like artillery flash. At 1650, the first rain-cooled preserved blood from Morrison's method was ready. The recipient, Corporal Kenneth Long, wounded in the chest, declining by the hour. The blood had been stored for 40 hours without notable warming. Morrison inserted the needle, watching the slow drip. Watch for chills, Kenneth. Tell me if you feel faint or sick. Hayes monitored pulse and skin. Long's lips regained some pink in minutes, his breathing eased. By 1720, no adverse reaction. Morrison fist-bumped Hayes, whose hands trembled. Word spread among the battalion. Doc Morrison saved a man with a bottle stuck in a mud pit. By late sunset, a waitlist of volunteers lined outside, Marines offering blood without being asked. Morrison hastily typed tags for bottles using a battered typewriter. The time, donor's initials, and date. In the background, artillery pounded the northern jungles as soldiers whispered about the crazy pit trick. Between 1900 and 2000, 3 more successful transfusions using preserved blood. Sergeant Hayes catalogued cell counts using microscope, confirming more than 70% cell integrity in samples up to 40 hours old. While the world outside deteriorated in fire and thunder, inside the tent hope grew. The next field test raised the stakes. Private Rodwell, badly burned, required a transfusion at 0030. Morrison rushed to the pit, hands covered in mud, fetching the next bottle stored for 38 hours. The transfusion worked. Rodwell improved within hours, even as Patterson arrived to witness the aftermath. "What's this?" he demanded, voice raw. "How many have survived?" Hayes held up the log. 4 out of 5 over 36 hours, better than at room temperature. Patterson was silent for a minute, then sighed deeply, hands shaking. "Continue. Carefully. If this goes wrong, the entire field hospital could be shut down." By 0215, critical improvements shaped the system. Morrison ordered pairs of Marines to guard the pits and regulate ice, rotate donors, and monitor temperature hourly. He designated Atwell to design a crude warning flag, white for optimal conditions, red for temperature spikes. Operation Blood Ice had begun, a hybrid of medical ingenuity, absolute urgency, and relentless discipline. Through that week's typhoon, as rain fell in sheets and mortar fire rattled the tin roof, Morrison's insane blood ice trick was debated in every foxhole and mess tent. Some said he was reckless, others said he was a genius. But every Marine, bleeding or whole, began to pray for the pit to hold. At 0145 on October 15th, the first shell screamed overhead, detonating in a rain-soaked palm behind the lines. It sent a thunderous jolt through Morrison's aid station. He jolted upright, heart hammering, hands clutching the blood log and pit schedule. Hayes barked behind him, "Incoming!" as artillery boomed and the wounded groaned from open cots lashed to crates. 100 yards away, 2 Marines carried Private Atwood, his leg shattered by shrapnel. "He needs blood bad," the stretcher-bearer gasped. Morrison barely looked up. "Type O, 10 units. Get donors." Outside, under starlit rain, the system swung into action. 40 volunteers lined the muddy trench, handing canteens and helmets full of icy rainwater, shivering under ponchos coated in red clay. Inside the tent, Morrison readied the blood bottles from the pit, each tag marked with white tape, time down to the minute. He checked the field thermometer. 39 degrees. "Perfect," he muttered. Hayes rushed over, cradling a bottle. Test results good. No visible separation. Donors gave in rapid succession, veins pressed and swabbed as rifle fire echoed. Morrison called "Rotate next." Each unit was drawn, tagged, and transferred to metal cases submerged in the cooling trench. Within the hour, 11 transfusions began. Morrison's hands never stopped moving. Clamp gauze, slow infusion, check for reaction. One by one he watched color return to the Marines' faces. Their pulses strengthened. Only a single mild fever appeared. All others recovered. Rain pounded harder, splattering mud into the pit, but Morrison and Hayes kept on. At 0429, Sergeant Hayes made the rounds and reported 9 out of 11 stable. Morrison wiped sweat and rain from his face. Monitor every 10 minutes for shock. Over the next hour, the aid station became a factory of hope. The word spread up and down the perimeter. Morrison's trick worked. Men who were dying began to sit up, speak, ask for water. Doesn't hurt much. Feels cold, Atwood said, eyes brightening. The next test followed at 0755. A runner brought Corporal Miles, stomach torn by grenade fragments. Morrison's system cranked up again. Blood delivered from units saved 36 hours in mud-cooled trenches. Every hand in the tent worked, past tubes or washed bottles. Out on the line, Hayes kept cycling through thermometers, recalibrating with ice from the morning rain. "When do you think this will stop?" Hayes whispered. Morrison shook his head, eyes hollow and red. "Not until it's light. Not until they get hungry enough to quit." Machine guns rattled in the jungle. Around 0929, artillery fell silent. The pit preserved 24 units. 11 had been transfused, 9 samples checked by microscope, cell count above 70%. At 1100 hours, Lieutenant Commander Patterson arrived, inspecting each survivor. He grunted. "Stats?" Morrison presented the log. "Survival 82%, 9 out of 11. No lethal reactions. Bottles up to 39 hours viable." Patterson scowled, then nodded reluctantly. "Keep at it, Doc." On October 18th, the next assault began. Japanese soldiers surged through sodden brush, firing rifles at the perimeter. Within 3 hours, 67 wounded stacked up on crates and pallets. "Blood! All you got!" barked Sergeant Torres. Hayes called donor rotation. Morrison flagged new bottles. Atwell mixed anticoagulant. Rain kept falling. The pit's thermometer hovered at 38, 12 degrees cooler than the humid air outside. Marines stripped off jackets and shirts, lining up for draws. Morrison's hand cramped with each needle, but he dared not slow down. "Fast, but clean. Don't waste a drop," he muttered. Bottles sunk in the pits, insulated by cargo chutes and river stones. 21 transfusions, 37 saved in 24 hours. By 1600 hours, the blood pit held 100 units. Hayes logged every shift of temperature. "We're holding stable." Morse code clacked on the field radio. Morrison ignored it, focused on staving off the next crisis. "Bottles at 39, test them at midnight, recheck at 0000 hours. Outside, thunder rolled. Hayes drew up a new batch of blood just before dusk. On October 24th, Henderson Field was hit hard. Bombs shattered coconut palms near the supply run. Morrison and Hayes barely slept, out in the rain, reburying bottles every 4 hours. Marines hauled ice from the mess hall to refresh the cooling system. At 0210, Atwell brought news. 89 alive out of 106. Docs up north want your method. Japanese snipers crept close as men ran with buckets of rainwater, risking their lives for a pint of blood. Morrison focused on the rapid cycle transfusion system. The field thermometer spiked only twice, and both times Atwell corrected it in minutes. From the pit came blood for Corporal Reynard, 52 hours old, and still viable. Within 12 hours, Reynolds walked again, eyes clear. The next cycle pressed on. Rain and exhaustion blurred the hours as October gave way to November. The system grew in size and complexity. Marines learned each step, forming a routine. At 0200 hours, Hayes tabulated numbers. 76% survival on last batch. The system is working, Bob. Morrison nodded, voice rough. No deaths from transfusion. First in 3 weeks. On November 2nd, a monsoon lashed the island. Floodwaters nearly swamped the aid station. Morrison directed teams to dig deeper pits, haul more stone. Hayes organized donor patrols through ankle-deep mud. Blood bottles lasted up to 96 hours in the coldest rain. Morrison coached 6 hospitalmen, drilling step by step. Tag, draw, chill, infuse, monitor, repeat. In the final week of November, Morrison implemented a full field training for the system. He built a checklist, weatherproofed with wax, for every new medic. "You work fast, you test often, you document every step," he ordered. Atwell handled microscope checks and temperature logs. The technique spread. 3 battalion aid stations started replication. Patterson became a reluctant advocate, praising results while repeating, "Keep it low profile." As weeks passed, statistics climbed. Over 3 battles, 250 units of blood preserved and delivered. More than 200 Marines survived injuries that should have killed them. News of the crazy blood pit reached regimental command. Morrison prepared a technical summary citing cell counts and survival rates. "It's worth reporting. If this goes division-wide, we could save hundreds more," he told Hayes. Night after night rain fell, guns roared in the distance, and men pressed on under brilliant lightning. Morrison often sat by the pit, exhausted but hopeful, hands muddy and eyes searching the horizon. He knew every unit of blood was a moment stolen from death. He promised himself he would never waste a single drop. By 06:10 on November 28th, the Monsoon reached its peak. The jungle was transformed into a roaring, half-submerged world of mud and water. In the aid station, Morrison's hands trembled from fever. For 9 consecutive weeks, he had averaged no more than 4 hours of sleep a night, working shifts of 19 to 21 hours straight. Hayes watched him finish the last transfusion for a Marine wounded by mortar fragments. Morrison's eyes were sunken, cheekbones sharp beneath sweat and mosquito bites. "Doc, you need rest." "You're burning up," Atwell said, worry deepening the new lines on his face. Morrison shook his head, voice a nervous rasp. "Can't stop. Rain's still cold. Blood still keeps." He collapsed onto a crate, coughing, then wiped his brow. The thermometer read 104. Shivers racked him as he tried to log cell counts for the night's dozen transfusions. Outside, the line of donors thinned. Hayes had started splitting duties among new volunteers. Atwell took over the microscope checks, while Private Carver tagged samples and managed the pit temperatures to keep every bottle between 38 and 40 degrees. Morrison trained them by rote, repeating, "Tag, draw, chill, infuse, repeat. Check temperatures every hour, no bad blood ever." He clung to the routine to keep the operation running, even as he faded. Day faded to night, and the storm kept up, rattling the patched roof. On the 30th, Hayes discovered Morrison slumped unconscious next to the pit, mud on his uniform, hypothermic. "He's got malaria," Atwell realized, pointing to the fever chart. "Get him to the surgery tent. I'll cover the pit." Morrison was stretchered away, semi-delirious, mumbling instructions. "No warm bottles. Quick, rotate. Daniel, is that you?" The aid station ran on momentum. In his absence, some things slipped. On December 3rd, a rushed pairing of donor and recipient ended poorly. Private Ferris, already weak from fever, volunteered for a double draw and was too weak to recover. 2 days later, a mislabeled bottle made its way into a transfusion of Corporal Lang, resulting in a transfusion reaction. Lang survived but spent days fighting kidney damage. Hayes confronted Atwell in frustration. "We can't let it slip. Doc never did. Even sick as a dog, he checked every tag." Atwell grimaced, nodding. "He knew," he said quietly. "He always knew." Despite setbacks, the method endured. Still, 3 Marines died during December from errors in blood typing or storage. Each death marked Hayes and the team, especially when Hayes had to write a letter to Corporal Lang's family, explaining that a new system had nearly cost them their son. Morrison, weak but recovering, raged at his own helplessness. He insisted on overseeing logs and test results even from his cot. "No shortcuts," he barked hoarsely. "Even when it rains non-stop. Triple-check everything." Yet the rain sometimes failed them. For 3 days in early December, a dry spell struck, the air stifling and hot. The pits could not hold temperature. Half the bottles from those days spoiled. Hayes watched 5 units soaked in sweat and effort, dumped into the river as unfit for use. "We're blind without the rain," Hayes told Atwell. "We make do. No other option." Even in weakness, Morrison dispatched runners to try to fetch ice from the mess hall or leverage shade from collapsed palm fronds. Morale suffered as casualties mounted and the margin for error shrank. Some officers grew suspicious. Captain Elliott, newly arrived, challenged the system openly. "I'll be reporting this. Field medicine is no excuse for gambling with men's lives." Hayes bristled, replaying the words with Morrison later. "Ignore him," Morrison growled. 19 out of 20 are walking out of here. But skepticism was persistent, especially with deaths from error now present in the log. Word of the field technique reached the Bureau of Medicine in Washington. By telegram, a request came for detailed notes, survival rates, failure rates, complications. Atwell spent a night writing the full report in pencil, recounting every step, every deviation from protocol. Hayes sent numbers by radio. Bureau officials replied with skepticism, calling the procedure improvisation bordering on reckless endangerment. On December 17th, during another heavy bombardment, Morrison collapsed mid-infusion. Hayes was forced to call for evacuation to the main division hospital. As Morrison was lifted to the ambulance, men from the battalion lined the road, saluting in silence. He opened his eyes once, caught Atwell by the sleeve. "Don't let up. Not for a minute. Those men, they need you." Morale plummeted with Morrison gone, but Atwell and Hayes redoubled efforts, drilling every new hospitalman personally, enforcing strict discipline on typing, tag checks, and storage. Mistakes lessened. The blood pit continued to operate despite storms and sniper fire. In the hospital tent, Morrison scribbled continuous letters to Hayes and the team, writing, "Sacrifice is no excuse for carelessness. They need you now more than ever." By end of December, Patterson, the once skeptical chief medical officer, visited Morrison in recovery. "I was wrong, Doc," he admitted, sitting on the cot beside him. "You saved more lives in 4 months than some men save in a lifetime." Morrison managed a thin smile, voice barely audible. "Thank the rain, thank Hayes. Thank all of them who bled to keep this running." Still, resentment lingered among higher command. An inquiry began in February of the next year, Navy authorities convening to determine whether Morrison's unauthorized technique violated standing protocol. For 2 weeks, doctors reviewed the logs, deaths, and successes. Patterson spoke in Morrison's defense before the board. He broke the rules, he declared, but in breaking them he saved hundreds. Hayes testified. So did Atwell. Even Captain Elliott conceded the method, though controversial, radically exceeded conventional outcomes. In the aftermath, the price of progress was clear. Morrison lost 3 men to error, lost 32 pounds from fever and exhaustion, nearly lost his own life in pursuit of the system. But for every failure, there were 5 men hobbling back, writing home to families, surviving what should have been mortal wounds. He later wrote in his journal, "No one counts the dead in peacetime, but every name here was a man I refused to lose when the rain was with us." For Morrison, the greatest cost was not his own suffering, but the memory of those who died just before the breakthrough, or because of faltering discipline during his illness. As 1942 came to an end, the blood pit still operated, now watched day and night by men who had witnessed its power. Morrison's system, for all its flaws, kept hope alive through 10 more weeks of hell on Guadalcanal. At 0700 hours on March 3, 1943, Morrison stood in the main division hospital tent, a new layer of resolve hiding the exhaustion still etched in his eyes. He returned to Guadalcanal with a limp, a lingering tremor in his left hand from months of fever. But his presence drove a current of energy through the medical staff. Hayes greeted him with a grin, holding up the latest logbook. 76 transfusions last week. Survival rate is 74%. No major reactions. Morrison took the book, flipping pages with care. He recognized the handwriting of Atwell and the meticulous notes lining each margin. News of the blood ice pit had spread by word of mouth, telegram, and rumor. The Bureau of Medicine had finally sent their reply. The technique was validated as field expedient, with new guidelines for use in tropical theaters. Morrison received a bundled packet from headquarters, Field Manual 23B, the culmination of his effort, now cited in medical records. Hayes dropped the pamphlet on Morrison's cot and laughed. "The system's official, Doc. You're famous up the chain." Adoption came quickly. By April, the Navy Medical Corps shipped metal-lined chests and more robust thermometers with the next supply drop. Battalion aid stations in Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima built their own cooling systems based on Morrison's rainwater method. Field reports streamed in from every island. The Morrison technique preserved blood for 4 days, 8 men survived blast wounds who would have been lost. Medics wrote for more training, requesting diagrams, checklists, and logs. Hayes answered each with the patience Morrison had instilled in him. Keep it simple. Tag every sample. Cold water, steady hands, no shortcuts. In June, Dr. Patterson composed a letter to Navy Bureau headquarters, crediting Morrison with saving hundreds by direct innovation in field medicine. Patterson's words echoed in every divisional debrief. What saved Guadalcanal wasn't luck. It was a young man's refusal to accept death as procedure. Morrison read the letter quietly, shoulders slumping in relief. That's all any of us ever wanted, he murmured. Throughout 1943, as the Pacific War raged, Morrison's method expanded. New donors volunteered every week. The donor program grew to cover entire regiments. In Okinawa, a young corpsman recorded, 28 units stored with field ice, 24 recipients survived. Morrison devoted evenings to coaching new medics, writing and revising checklists, training in everything from vein selection to crisis management. Letters arrived from all corners of the Pacific, fathers, wives, and children, thanking Morrison for giving their loved ones another chance. By January 1944, Navy statisticians assembled a study. 410 Marines had survived critical blood loss on Guadalcanal using Morrison's cooling pits, double the number saved by standard procedure. The estimated total across the Pacific exceeded 12,000 lives by the war's end. Morrison shook his head as Hayes read the figures aloud in the candlelit aid station. All that from an idea in the rain, Morrison said softly, and all those men with families now, because we trusted cold water and a little bit of luck. The impact did not fade with the war's end. After the Japanese surrender, Morrison was promoted Chief Pharmacist's Mate, awarded the Navy Cross. Media soon picked up the story. Life magazine ran a profile on the innovation, and Morrison gave a quiet interview. I broke every rule, but the rules would have killed us. Sometimes you need to ask forgiveness, not permission. In 1945, Morrison returned home, finishing medical school and specializing in hematology. He founded the first mobile blood bank clinic in his county, designing a compact, ice-cooled storage chest for emergency use. By the 1950s, the Morrison protocols underpinned civilian blood preservation systems across the United States. Military and civilian hospitals cited Guadalcanal method in standard operating procedures. The medical impact continued. In 1949, cryopreservation research referenced Morrison's original field notebooks. By 1953, glycerol was added to deep-freeze blood for transoceanic transport, launching modern blood banking. The Morrison system became a milestone. By 1960, it was estimated 21 million units of blood were preserved annually using cooling techniques first tested on Guadalcanal. Morrison's legacy transformed further when NASA invited him as a consultant in 1968, seeking methods to preserve blood in zero gravity. He traveled to Houston, advising on portable cooling systems for astronauts. Hayes wrote to him, "Never thought mud pits would get you to the moon." Morrison replied, "All innovation starts with fixing what's broken, whether on an island or orbiting the Earth." Over the years, Morrison remained humble. He wrote annual letters to the families of Marines he'd saved, kept logbooks on his shelf, and lectured quietly on field medicine. Photographs from Guadalcanal decorated his study, mud pits, handwritten charts, faces of grateful survivors. In 1994, Morrison died peacefully at 76, surrounded by family, including 23 grandchildren, descended from Marines saved on the island. Hayes visited his grave every year, laying a helmet filled with cold water and wildflowers. "You gave us a chance, Doc. You made heroes out of all of us." Today, blood preservation in disaster zones, war zones, and research labs trace their lineage to a rain-soaked island. Medical textbooks describe how adaptive innovation at Guadalcanal changed doctrine, saving millions while altering the trajectory of battlefield and civilian medicine forever. What Morrison did, risked punishment, stretched every limit, bent every rule, lives on wherever life is balanced on the edge. An idea, a pit, and cold rain turned tragedy into hope for generations yet unborn.